Hi guys, it's Mrs. Vanderveen. I wanted to read to you a very important book called Sit In: How Four Friends Stood Up by Sitting Down. It's by Andrea Davis Pinkney and illustrated by Brian Pinkney, and it tells the story of four young college students who are Black students at the college North Carolina A&T University. That's right here in Greensboro. This story takes place right where we live. It used to be back in the past that if you were Black, you were not allowed to go to the same places than if you were white. And these four college students decided that was not fair. And they stood up by sitting down. They had a sit in. So what they did was they went to this lunch counter in Woolworth store, and they decided that they would stay there until they were served food just like everybody else. So let's read to see what happens. We must meet hate with love. These were Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words that got him started. Four hungry friends eager to eat. Each took a seat at Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. David, Joseph, Franklin, and Ezell sat quiet and still, with hearts full of hope. With Dr. King's words, strong and close, they were college students with a plan. It was February 1st, 1960. This happened this month in February. Oh my goodness. Over 60 years ago. They didn't need menus. Their order was simple: a donut and coffee with cream on the side. Woolworth's was busy, so the friends waited, patiently, silently, without a fuss. They were the only Black kids at the counter. David, Joseph, Franklin, and Ezell sat while everyone else got served. At first, they were treated like the hole in the donut, invisible. Others tried to ignore them. The waitress watched and refused them. This was a sign of the times: whites only. At this time, a lot of places in the South where we live in North Carolina had signs like this that said whites only in the window. And if it said that, if you were Black, you were not allowed to come in. They were allowed to say you couldn't enter buildings. They were allowed to say you couldn't eat at restaurants. And this is one of those places they were not allowed to eat. Woolworths had a lunch counter. They would serve sandwiches and things like that. So when you were shopping, you could stop and eat, and then you can continue your shopping. So it wasn't a fancy restaurant. It was just a counter. But you could only sit there if you were white. And these boys sat down here anyway. So let's see why they chose to do that. This was the law's recipe for segregation. Its instructions were easy to follow. Do not combine white people with Black people. Segregation was a bitter mix. Now it was the friends' turn to ignore and refuse. They ignored the law. They refused to leave until they were served. Those kids had a recipe too. A new brew called integration. It was just as simple. Combine Black with white to make sweet justice. For them, integration was better than any chef's special. Integration was finer than homemade cake. Integration was a recipe that would take time. So I noticed something about the server that works here. The server who works here is Black. She is serving the people who are white at the counter. Even though she is allowed to work at the lunch counter, she is not allowed to eat at the lunch counter. That makes me very sad. She can also probably lose her job if she chose to serve them. So you can see she is just serving the white people at the counter. So David, Joseph, Franklin, and Ezell sat quiet and still, with hearts full of hope, with Dr. King's words strong and close. Be loving enough to absorb evil. They sat straight and proud and waited and wanted a donut and coffee with cream on the side. And after sitting and waiting and wanting, a police officer came. But the four friends wouldn't leave. Uh-oh. The police officer didn't know what to do. The students were doing nothing wrong. There's no crime in sitting, no harm in being quiet, no danger in looking hungry. The officer left the lunch counter without doing anything. So you can see here's the manager of Woolworths. So even though they were sitting here, the police officer did not arrest them because they weren't doing anything that was upsetting or dangerous. They were just sitting there quietly. Now, if they had been yelling or shouting or doing something disrespectful, maybe it would have been different. But because they were being quiet and respectful, the police officer did not arrest them. The Woolworths man turned off the lights and he announced, "Woolworths is closed." So the customers left, including the four friends, who went home to dinner where they were served first. So even though they were not doing anything wrong, the man who ran Woolworths closed the store for the day and kicked out everybody because he thought that would be the only way he could get rid of them from sitting at the lunch counter. But look and see what happens next. News had already spread about the sit-in. David, Joseph, Franklin, and Ezell got their names in the paper. The next day, February 2nd, 1960, more students showed up at the lunch counter, sitting still for what was right. No reservations needed at Woolworths. The students seated themselves. They were dressed in their best clothes. They were polite and determined. So just like the four boys did the day before, they dressed up, they were polite, and they sat quietly. They were just waiting to be served. No guesswork for the waitress. The young people knew the menu by heart. They ordered. No food came. So they sat in silence and waited and wanted a donut and coffee with cream on the side. The waitress reminded them whites only. But those kids wouldn't budge. They didn't move until they were served. They refused. All they wanted was some food, a donut and coffee with cream on the side. To pass the time, the students read their school books. They wrote in their journals. They finished their homework. They didn't need to read the menu, so they studied for tomorrow's test. Also, they brought things with them to keep themselves busy because they knew they were going to be sitting there a really long time. So since they were college students, they had things to study, so they brought things with them to keep them entertained while they were sitting. They were ready to sit all day long if they needed to. Wow. Well, what started in Greensboro had spread faster than grease fire. There was a lunch counter protest in Hampton, Virginia, Nashville, Tennessee, Montgomery, Alabama, Atlanta, Georgia, and many other southern towns. If lunch counters could go from whites only to all welcome, if segregation could turn into integration, if black people and white people could break bread together, everyone would pass the test. Everyone would score high, A+ with that coffee and cream on the side. So their idea, the poor teenage college students, their great idea was spreading all over the country. They realized this was working. It was starting to frustrate the people who owned these lunch counters, that these people would sit there all day. They couldn't sell food to people who actually wanted to buy some because they were taking up their spaces. It was starting to frustrate the people who owned those stores. But many folks were not motivated to make that grade. As sit-ins grew, angry people gave the students a big dose of hatred, served up hot and heaping. Coffee was poured down their backs. Milkshakes flung in their faces. Pepper thrown in their eyes. Ketchup not on the fries but dumped on their heads. They yelled at the students, "We don't serve your kind. Go home. Goodbye." The students wanted to lash out but couldn't. They wanted to strike back but didn't. Sitting still was so hard. Practicing peace while others showed hatred was tougher than any school test. They were trying to do what Martin Luther King Jr. had taught them, what Gandhi had taught Martin Luther King, that if you fight with violence, it will not be as effective. So they were trying so hard to be calm. Now there were news cameras filming the sit-ins, and viewers at home watched it all on TV. The students were more determined than ever to show the world the true meaning of peace, so they sat in silence, with hearts full of hope, with Dr. King's dream true and close. These were the words that kept them going. We must meet violence with non-violence. So even though people were doing horrible things to them, they were dumping milkshakes on their heads, they were pouring things down their backs, they were throwing pepper in their eyes, they still sat there quietly and peacefully. I can't imagine doing that. It must have been incredibly difficult. But they wanted to keep those words of Dr. Martin Luther King. We must meet violence with nonviolence. The students sat proud and still and waited and wanted a donut and coffee with cream on the side, and soon the sit-ins grew bigger and wider. White students joined their Black friends to protest the unfair treatment by restaurant owners who would not serve food to Black patrons. They also opposed segregated libraries, buses, parks, and pools. So this started to grow. It became not just a thing that was for Black people to say no. Black people and white people started to say no. They realized it was not fair. With so many students gathered, people got scared there would be fighting. They were afraid of all those youngsters grouped together for a cause. Even though the students were committed to peace, the police now took action. They accused students of loafing. They arrested them. They took them to jail. The students didn't resist. They didn't fight. Instead, they sang freedom songs to keep the peace. They held Dr. King's words steady and close. Demonstrate calm dignity. Soon, folks were so busy arguing about who was right and who was wrong that they stopped going to Woolworths and other segregated places. Some shops were forced to integrate to keep their businesses alive, but the struggle was far from over. In April, an activist named Ella Baker organized a student leadership conference at Shaw University in North Carolina to help the young demonstrators. With Ella, the students formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. Inspired by Dr. King, they came up with powerful words of their own. These are the words that became the SNCC slogan. We are all leaders. So they decided they were going to come together as college students to become leaders. What a wonderful idea. When President John F. Kennedy got a taste of the SNCC's integration, he didn't sit in. He stepped in. On June 11th, 1963, the president went on TV. He urged Americans to treat each other fairly. He then told Congress to take action against segregation. This became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So he said, President John F. Kennedy said, this is not right. We need to stop this. It's not right to have these people separated from one another. Why can't we all just be together? So he decided to make this a rule, a law. And on July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson made that act a law. It banned segregation in public places. The hard work and courage of those brave students had been paid off, and they had taken a bite out of segregation. Now it was time to savor equality. Now they were ready for a big sip of freedom. Their order was simple: a double dose of peace with nonviolence on top. Hold the hate, leave off the injustice. So it finally happened. They signed into law that you could no longer be separated just because of the color of your skin. So they did it. Now the students had the right recipe for integration. The steps were easy to follow. Start with love, add conviction, season with hope, add extra faith to flavor. Mix Black people with white people. Let unity stand. Fold in change. Sprinkle with dignity. Bake until golden. Serve immediately. Makes enough for all. After weeks of sitting when their backsides ached, after months of being still when their feet fell asleep, after years of praying for laws to change, when they were so hungry for equality, The young people finally got what they ordered, and it was worth the wait. It was served to them exactly how they wanted it. Well done. And oh, integration sure tasted good. Those courageous young people enjoyed every bit. They came back to Woolworths for seconds and thirds and for many helpings after that. When the sit ins were all done, the students left a big tip: a donut and coffee with cream on the side. It's not about food, it's about pride. These were the words that filled them up. I think that's so amazing that this happened right here where we live. And actually, what they did was they created a museum out of the Woolworth building, where they had this exact same lunch counter. You can actually go there today. It's a civil rights museum right here in Greensboro. And you can see the exact lunch counter where they sat and where they tried to order food. It's still there. And so you guys will get to go on a field trip in sixth grade because they do that with all sixth graders in Guilford County. But that's right here. And if you ever go downtown and you see the Woolworth building, that is where this happened. How brave of these students to go and stand up for what was right. And it's important to remember, if you think that you see something that is wrong, stand up for it. Because if you are standing up, we're going to have a much better future, just like we have a better future today because of these guys. I hope you enjoyed our book, Sit In, How Four Friends Stood Up by Sitting Down, and I hope you have an awesome day. Thanks.